So the I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term, or the HEAL initiative, and it's one of several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the COARS network. So this webinar is the third webinar in our researcher training series, and it's the second webinar that's geared specifically towards folks who would like to be studying recovery housing. So what does that mean? It means that we've developed webinars and topics that are particularly relevant to conducting research on recovery housing. And each webinar in this series will focus on a specific methodological aspect of research. In addition to presenting a primer of sorts on that research topic, the webinars will also highlight research from recovery housing researchers that have used that particular technique. So the topic for this month's webinar is sampling methods. Next slide, please. So I'm Amy Maracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. The team also includes investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subbaraman and Liba Lee, communications specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebzu, and the team's project coordinator Quinoja Capitani. Next slide, please. The I-STARR project activities are guided by a 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. So while most advisory board members wear many different hats, multiple hats often, they represent stakeholders such as recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. We may have some of our advisory board members in our audience, and I'm excited to share that a number of our advisory board members will also serve as presenters in this webinar series. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit of background on the I-STARR project. But before I introduce today's webinar and webinar presenters, we'd like to get some information about who's in the virtual room here. So there are just 4 polling questions today. And the 4 polling questions are: what best describes your field of study? At what stage in your studies are you in this field? How familiar are you with different types of sampling strategies? And we want to just get a sense of kind of what sampling strategy you're most interested in learning about. So if we could launch the poll now, that'd be perfect.
Quinoja, do you mind launching the poll as the co-host?
Excellent. And for the Zoom poll, it looks like you'll have to scroll down to answer all of the questions, and it won't let you move on until you answer all questions. But once you do, just hit the submit button, and that will clear the poll from your screen. And we'll give folks a few minutes to complete the polling. And once we get about 60 to 70%, maybe even 80%, we'll share the results. There needs to be some sort of polling music that happens in this process. The silence is awkward.
There.
I don't know. We could start humming, do something.
Okay.
I'm surprised that Zoom's not on top of this already.
Listening to a not awesome webinar.
Where are we at in our polling at this point? Can we share the results? There we go. So looking at these results, we have the largest group represented here is social work, but we also have psychology, folks in the field of psychology, health sciences and sociology, And I forgot to mention, whenever you have to use the something else, feel free to type into the chat what that something else is. At what stage are you at in your studies? So most people have completed their terminal educational degree within the past year or the past 10 years, but we have some folks also who have been in the field a little bit longer. Familiarity with different types of recovery strategy or sampling strategies. So fairly familiar, and what are people are interested in hearing about both kinds of sampling strategies. So this is fabulous. Well, I think that given these responses, I think there'll be something here for everyone. If you're looking to learn about different types of sampling methods, you're definitely in the right place. And if you have particular expertise in a type of sampling approach, but you have yet to apply it in recovery housing research, you'll hear from folks who have done this kind of work. So next slide, please. So we actually have 3 different presenters for this webinar. I'll be presenting an example of probability-based sampling methods from one of my studies, but you'll also hear from 2 superstars, Meena Subbaraman and Elizabeth Mahoney. So Meena Subbaraman is a biostatistician in the Behavioral Health and Recovery Studies group at the Public Health Institute. She received her master's degree in statistics from Stanford University and a PhD in epidemiology from UC Berkeley. Her research interests include causal inference, methods for studying mediators, moderators, and mechanisms of action, recovery from substance use disorders, treatment from alcohol use disorders, recovery housing, cannabis use and alcohol policy, cannabis use and alcohol substitution and complementarity, and research policies related to substance use during pregnancy. Before joining the Behavioral Health and Recovery Studies group, she worked in the alcohol research group for 14 years, where she served as the director for the statistical and data sciences group for 2 years. So we'll also be hearing from Elizabeth Mahoney, and you'll hear me refer to her as Liz. Liz is the project manager in the Behavioral Health and Recovery Studies group at the Public Health Institute. She received her undergraduate degree in psychology from Boston College and her master's in international disaster psychology from the University of Denver. Liz is currently the project manager for 2 studies examining the outcomes of sober living house residents, one funded by NIDA, which you'll hear more about later, and another funded by NIAAA. She previously worked on another NIDA-funded study testing the effectiveness of a motivational interviewing and case management intervention among sober living house residents who were involved in the criminal legal system. And prior to joining the Behavioral Health and Recovery Studies group, Liz worked at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Addiction Studies, where she worked as a project manager on several studies that evaluated the effectiveness of new approaches to treating addiction to a variety of different substances. And so with those introductions, I'm going to hand things off to our presenters, starting with Dr. Subbaraman. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking about sampling theory, just a very brief overview, and the different types of sampling strategies. It looks like a lot of folks in this room are in this virtual room are familiar with sampling and sampling strategies. So perhaps this will be a little bit of a review, but hopefully you'll also learn something new. And we'll also go over an example of recruiting individuals in recovery. And then Liz will go into a more specific example of purposive sampling recovery houses. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Modern Epidemiology. It's one of my favorite epi textbooks from Kenneth Rothman. So this is laying out sampling theory. Our subjects in a study, whether we literally sample them or not, they're viewed as a figurative sample of the possible people who could have been in the study, or of the different possible experiences that we could have studied. So conceptually, the actual subjects, the actual units of observation, whether these are individuals, whether these are houses, they're always considered a sample of a broader experience of interest. Next slide, please. So here we have a diagram that shows how the sample, the data that we have from our sample is really nested within a study population that's nested within a larger target population. And the target population, that's whom we want to make inferences about. That's who we want to make conclusions, some sorts of statements about. So we have an example here. Say that our target population is recovery residences in the US. So that's who we want to make conclusions or inferences about. But what we have available due to whether it's eligibility criteria, a sampling frame, we have a study population. So next. Right, so our study population, maybe it's a sampling frame, the recovery residences registered with NAR. So we have a registry here, NAR being the National Association of Recovery Residences. That gives us a study population from whom we can perhaps next random sample from. There we go. So we have a random sample nested within our study sample, our study population, nested within this larger target population. And the target population, that's who we want to make conclusions about. Next slide, please. So when we use probability-based statistics, which we often do when we are running regressions, when we're doing a simple bivariate test, a t-test, or a chi-squared test, we're looking at the p-values, we're looking at the confidence intervals to make some sort of inference, right? Is it significant or not? And the inference that we want to make is about the target population, but of course, we only have data from our sample. It's very important to remember when we are using probability-based statistics, we are making an assumption that our sample is random. So that's a very important assumption that's often taken for granted when we're running regressions and looking at our results. The statistics that we're using assume that the sample was random. Next slide, please. But that's not the only type of sampling that there is, right? Random sampling is just one of three main types of sampling. So we have convenience, purposive, and random. Next slide, please. So starting off with convenience sampling, this is a non-random sampling method where our units of observation are selected into the sample because they are convenient. They are the easiest to access. And they might be easiest to access because of geographical proximity. They're just close by, they're in the right place at the right time, or they're just willing to participate in our research. So while I was reading about sampling and preparing for this, I learned that this is sometimes called accidental sampling. And examples of convenience sampling could be volunteers, individuals who happen to come to a treatment facility or recovery houses that you are familiar with, that you know. So there are pros and cons to convenient sampling. Perhaps the most obvious pro is that it's convenient. Maybe it's easier than doing a random sample. And another important pro is that there's a potential for high internal validity. So if you were able to make it to the webinar last month on experimental and quasi-experimental recovery housing and research designs, Dr. Shropshire and Dr. Polson spoke about how sometimes we want to increase our high internal validity at the cost of external validity. So that's our generalizability. So internal validity is the accuracy, it's the truthfulness, the trustworthiness of our responses. So perhaps if we know that we're going to a treatment facility, we know these individuals are in treatment because that's where we recruited them from, we have some sort of trustworthiness. Okay, these responses do reflect our population of interest treated individuals, but this comes at this cost. Okay, well now we can't generalize to a larger population of individuals in recovery because not everybody went to treatment, right? So there's a trade-off perhaps of internal validity and external validity when you're using a convenient sample. But Dr. Polson also mentioned reasons for using a convenient sample, like for his studies on sober living houses, there were no preliminary data. So there wasn't a sampling frame, there was nowhere to go to get a random sample. So in a situation like this, where you're doing cutting edge work, you're starting off collecting preliminary data, it might make sense to have a convenient sample so that you can get your high internal validity. Next slide, please. So the next type of sampling strategy is purposive sampling. So this is also referred to as selective or subjective sampling. It's another type of non-random sampling method. And in this case, the characteristics of the sample are defined for the purpose specific to your study. So this can really help us match the sample to the aims of the study, to the objectives, and again, potentially improve data quality, improve internal validity. It's important to remember that the more inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have, the more purposive your sample becomes. So this comes, of course, with pros and cons. Pros being this potential for high internal validity, high accuracy. You also have the potential to make your sample homogeneous. So your individuals, your units of observation might be more similar to each other, because the more inclusion, exclusion criteria you have, the more strict the eligibility criteria become, the more similar the individuals become. This makes the sample homogeneous, that increases statistical power, so statistical significance can be more easily attainable. The cost of that, again, is low external validity. So you might lose your ability to generalize to a larger population, to your target population. Next slide, please. So here's an example of purposive sampling of individuals in recovery. This comes from Lee Cascuda's What is Recovery study that she led, 10 years ago now. And the purpose of the overarching What is Recovery study was to develop a definition of recovery from the individuals who themselves self-define as in recovery. So if we take a look at the background here in the abstract, the lack of an established sampling frame makes reaching individuals in recovery difficult, right? There is no registry of individuals in recovery. There's no sampling frame or list that we can go to and take a random sample. So even though we have general population studies that are generalizable, we have a really low prevalence of individuals in recovery in the Gen Pop. So a Gen Pop study is very costly and inefficient for studying individuals in recovery. And as I mentioned earlier, although perhaps convenient and more efficient, if we go to a treatment facility, we know that sample is biased because not everyone in recovery has been to treatment. So the purpose of this paper here, this multi-source recruitment strategies, was an overview of all the different recruitment strategies that we use to reach a very diverse sample of 10,000, it's a big number, individuals in recovery that really represent as diverse of an experience in recovery as we could capture. Next slide, please. So the objectives for this particular paper, yes, there we go. So the three overarching goals for this particular paper, like I said, was to describe the sources that we used for reaching the large, diverse sample of 10,000 individuals from recovery from substance use disorders. Next. Right, so here we have our table of the sources that we use to reach these individuals in recovery. So you can see, for example, that using Craigslist, we got about 12% of the sample. So 12% of 10,000 is 1,200 people. We reached via Craigslist. Our most successful recruitment source was this other source. Next, please. There you go. So the other category, oh, there you go. Thank you. So the other category included recovery blogs and webcasts. I did an interview with a recovery blog. Lee Cascudas did some interviews as well. We had a commercial on Univision, the Hispanic TV channel. We had some radio spots on Christian radio programs. We really tried to reach as many individuals as in recovery as possible through these very diverse channels. Next slide. Great. So a quick check-in. You can just pop your answer in the chat. Treatment samples don't generalize to the larger population of individuals in recovery. Oh, it's a poll. Great. So they don't generalize to the larger population of individuals in recovery because what? They're not convenient, they're not purposive, or they're not random. Give me 10 to 15 more seconds. Great, thank you. Looks like 87%, they're not random. Great, so, right, treatment samples don't represent the larger sample of individuals in recovery, right? Like we mentioned before, not everyone in recovery has been to treatment. And of course, random samples are the only samples that meet the assumptions that we're making with our statistics. Next slide, please. So, okay, great segue into random sampling. In a random or probability sample, all individuals have a fixed and known or equal probability of being selected into our sample. So in order to select a random sample, we just make a list of individuals in our study population. So that could be a registry or some sort of sampling frame. We assign a sequential number to each observation, each individual, and then select some predetermined number using a random number generator. And we can do that using statistical software. So the pros and cons of random sampling, as we mentioned, it's the only sampling method that meets the assumptions of the statistics that we use to make inferences about our target population. However, it can be very difficult and sometimes impossible to truly randomly sample from the target population. Next slide, please. So even within random sampling, we do have two types of random samples. So we can do a simple random sample where everyone just has an equal chance of being selected from the study population. Or we can have a stratified random sample where we divide the study population into subgroups or strata, and then randomly sample within strata. So the proportion of the sample that we draw from each stratum, we usually weight those according to the population distribution of that variable. So for example, if 60% of the target population, the parent population is men, then 60% of the stratified random sample should also consist of men. Next slide, please. So we can do random sampling within a convenience or purposive sample, but if you do that, you need to remember that the generalizability is only possible to the population defined by your selection criteria. So for example, like we saw in one of our earlier slides, we can take a random sample from the NAR registry, but then our results likely only generalize to houses registered with NAR. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll do one last poll question. The attendees of this webinar make up what kind of sample of recovery researchers? Is it convenience, purposive, or random? You can go ahead and share the results. Awesome. Okay, yeah, I would say this is a convenient sample. We were all in the right place at the right time. So I don't know, purposive. Yeah, I think this is a convenient sample. So thank you for your participation in the polls. I think that is my last slide for today. Great. Thank you for your attention and participation. I'll pass it off to Liz.
Okay, great. I am going to talk about an example of purposive sampling in a study where I was the project manager. So this was a longitudinal repeated measures design study that was conducted in Los Angeles County from 2018 to 2021. So the study PI on that was Dr. Polson, who spoke at the prior I-STARR webinar, and the goal was to enroll 600 participants. Next slide. The goal was to enroll 600 participants from at least 40 sober living houses to examine how neighborhood characteristics, architectural features, and the social environment within the houses were associated with recovery outcomes. So interviews were conducted at baseline, and then we followed up with the participants 6 and 12 months later. So we wanted to follow an intent to treat model here. So we looked at so we could look at what happens with all the new residents that come into sober living houses. So we attempted to follow up with all the participants, even if they left the house. So we worked with houses for this that were part of the Sober Living Network, which is a nonprofit organization that offers guidance and support to sober living houses. We were able to get contact and house information from them to identify potential houses for the study. So to provide a broad depiction of all the residents entering the houses and to maximize generalizability, we use few inclusion-exclusion criteria. So there was no randomization or intervention for this one. And Dr. Shropshire covered the pros and cons of this type of quasi-experimental design in the prior researcher webinar. So you can see that on the I-STARR website if you missed it. Here I'll talk about why we followed a purposive sampling design. Next slide. So why use purposive sampling? So as a reminder of what was just covered, the samples are non-random samples whose characteristics are defined for a purpose that's relevant to the study. So this means taking the time to look at prior research to identify the characteristics to create a plan. So here we used it for our recruitment plan to get a targeted sample of the neighborhoods of the sober livings. So the overall rationale of the study was based off of findings from prior research on how environmental factors may influence recovery outcomes. There was a prior study by Dr. Miracle that highlighted the significance of investigating both the net positive and negative aspects of neighborhoods of the sober living houses. So what she found was, for instance, higher fees corresponded to reduced socioeconomic neighborhood disadvantage and lower alcohol outlet density, but they were also associated with longer distance from treatment programs and recovery sources. So although this study didn't directly analyze how these factors affected the outcomes, they did observe the uneven distribution of positive and negative neighborhood attributes among the sober living houses that indicated that these houses are connected to both supportive and risky factors. But what factors could be related to recovery outcomes? So building upon other previous research that explored the relationship between neighborhoods and the trajectory of alcohol dependence, we thought that certain neighborhood characteristics might function as protective factors. So this included a high density of 12-step meetings, mental health services, and substance abuse treatment programs. And then on the other hand, other attributes like higher alcohol outlet density and poor transportation could heighten the risk of negative outcomes. So all of this pulled together, we wanted to be able to look at different neighborhood factors, house characteristics, and the resident traits and their recovery outcomes. So in order to do that, we knew we needed to have this a sample that to represent diverse house, neighborhood, and socioeconomic status characteristics. So then we laid out our recruitment plan. So we stratified on gender and SES. So we wanted to aim for at least 10 women's houses because we wanted to make sure women's houses were well represented. And we also wanted 40 houses in different neighborhoods stratified by SES disadvantage. So to do this, we used data from the US Census Bureau's American Community Surveys to examine the neighborhood's data on access to a car, education, income, and unemployment. The neighborhoods were all defined by the census tracts, and this data was then used to create a score for each of these eligible sober living houses that we then divided them into groups based on SES and gender. And then houses were randomly selected from each strata to be approved to be approached for the study. So we then began recruitment. Next slide, please. So having a recruitment plan is key for executing purposive sampling. Recruitment here was broken into 2 steps. So first, the house was recruited to ensure that we had their permission to recruit from there. And then we would approach the new residents in the house. So a house was considered recruited when they signed an informal agreement. We ended up recruiting 53 houses for this study. Some of these houses closed or we just weren't able to connect with new residents. So we ultimately had 48 houses in our sample. We wanted 15 participants from each house with equal distribution across the SES groups and at least 150 women. Next slide, please. So here's an outline of our house recruitment methods. So a lot of our success was based upon relationships from a prior study we had built with houses through the Sober Living Network. So this meant going to a lot of meetings and stopping by houses, but going to houses to introduce ourselves was our most successful recruitment method, but we found that some house managers were wary of us just showing up unannounced. So we had recruitment packets and emails that we sent out from the study PI, and then we also tried calling the house just to set up a time. But it really was actually making those in-person connections that was the best method for us. So that's kind of where, you know, as far as being able to recruit houses, and this being more of like a cost-efficient way with doing purposive sampling. This is what ends up happening with trying to recruit the houses. We also had prior study participants that would move to a new house and encourage that new house to join the study. And we were also very lucky to have some supportive houses that would reach out to other houses to kind of vouch for us. Next slide, please. So here you can see just a map of the different eligible houses throughout Los Angeles County. Next slide. And here's a map of the houses where we were ultimately able to recruit from. We had ended up with 11 female houses, 13 co-ed houses, and 24 male houses, and an even distribution across the SES ratings. We did end up ending recruitment early due to COVID-19, because that was basically kind of halved our recruitment rate. So we ended the study with 557 out of our 600 goal. 186 of these were female, so we reached our goal of 150 women, and we had equal representation across the neighborhoods. If we hadn't done a purposive sampling and had done convenience sampling instead, we most likely would have ended up with way more participants from one or two SES groups. So this was the whole purpose here was to have this nice distribution. And then, as Nina noted, as a con though of this, we can't make inferences to all sober living houses in the US from this, since we can only generalize to those sober livings in LA County that were part of the sober living network shown in the previous slide. So since not every sober living in the US could have been part of the sample, this is a non-random sample, but the wide variability in Los Angeles County did allow us to efficiently target. It does have a huge range of different SES from these neighborhoods, and I think it would be interesting to also look at a similar study like this, doing this in different settings, so like maybe in rural areas, just to see how those factors are related to the outcomes there. So next slide, please. Here's just a few reactions of our attempts to recruit. Pretty much we reviewed these weekly as a team and would kind of talk about how to respond to these, and we had scripts that we would try to cover common questions, but we were constantly updating it. And then we also discussed with the interviewers how they would want to respond to being asked, "Are you in recovery?" Because people naturally will ask that when going out in the field. Next slide, please. And here's some of the retention strategies that we used. So the reason going through all these recruitment and retention strategies are important is once you have this houses that we selected in our purposive sampling, we wanted to make sure that they were well represented in the final data set. So there's everything to be said for a plan, and then the whole thing as far as what do you end up with your final data set. So since we were focused on answering specific research questions that we knew it is at the expense of generalizability and ability to use different inferential statistical procedures later on. You want to make sure that you execute your plan so you can answer your research question well. And so Dr. Miracle will now talk about the examples of random sampling next.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz, for sharing information about the sampling strategy used to study recovery residences in the sober living house neighborhood study. So again, I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about probability-based sampling methods in recovery housing research. Next slide. So for this piece, I'm going to be talking about the I-STARR projects, and that's I-STARR projects with an S. I-STARR stands for the National Study of Treatment and Addiction Recovery Residences, and the two studies are the I-STARR Parent Project and the I-STARR COVID Supplement, and both studies are funded by NIAAA. So with respect to the parent project, there are 4 aims to this study, and I bulleted them here on this slide. So the first aim focused on examining the availability of recovery housing, all types of recovery housing across the country, and characterizing where recovery residences were located. The second aim involved conducting a national survey of recovery residence characteristics. And with this data collected from the survey, we proposed doing some really neat things with respect to empirically deriving a typology of recovery residences and examining characteristics associated with recovery housing evidence-based practices. So that's the parent project. The supplement is focused on was focused on studying implementation of COVID best practice guidelines and examining how the pandemic affected the availability of recovery housing. So this project was smaller in scope, just 2 years, and recruited a smaller sample of residences, but residences were followed over time, and we collected additional contextual data concerning health and health resources, as well as qualitative data from the residences that closed during the course of the study to get a better sense of factors that contributed to closure. Next slide, please. So both studies involved collecting survey data about individual recovery residences that we wanted to aggregate and generalize to recovery housing across the country without having to collect data from every single recovery residence in the country. So what sampling strategy did we come up with and why? So with respect to the parent study, we collected data from a state stratified random sample of recovery residences, where the number of residences sampled within each state reflected exact optimal allocation. That is a mouthful. So let me just unpack a little bit what that strategy reflects. So the first thing that we had to think about was our sample size, or how many residences needed to be in our study so that we could be confident that our sample represented recovery housing nationally and could address the aims that we wanted to achieve in our study. So we arrived at a sample size of 800, as that would produce a margin of error that was between 4 or 5%, with measures with fairly even distributions, even after taking into account moderate size design effects. This also fit the bill with respect to our other planned analyses as well. We also wanted to make sure that we had residences from all 50 states represented in this random sample, even residences in states that might have low probability of being selected at random among all residences in the US, because some states might have few recovery residences in them. So to ensure that residences in these low populated states were sampled, we stratified our sample by state. Thus, instead of randomly sampling residences from one hat or from one fishbowl, we randomly sampled residences from 50 hats or 50 fishbowls, well, 50 plus DC. So what did that mean in terms of how many residences were sampled from each state? Well, then we needed to decide on allocation of our 800 residences within each state. And sampling strategies in this regard generally fall into proportionate and disproportionate flavors. So proportionate sampling is where allocation within strata in the sample is reflected of the proportion of the strata within the population. So say, for example, if half of the recovery residences were in Texas, and this is a phony baloney example, but just follow me here, and we wanted to implement a proportionate sampling strategy. Half of our sample would then be from Texas as well, because that would be proportionate to what is represented in the population. So disproportionate sampling is often referred to as over or under sampling, and this comes into play when you want to ensure that your sample includes enough units of rarer strata so that analyses answering questions about the strata are adequately powered. And you often see this in population-based surveys where underrepresented groups are oversampled so that you can run analyses that are adequately powered to address differences between groups. So we ended up implementing a disproportionate sampling strategy called exact optimal allocation, because proportional sampling would have given us a lot of data from regions in the country that were not wholly mysterious, and we would have missed the opportunity to gather information from residences in regions that were underrepresented in the recovery housing literature. So we could probably spend an entire webinar on exact optimal allocation, but we chose that method basically because it allowed us to set minimum sample sizes for states with few residences and maximum sample sizes for states with lots of residences to avoid extreme over or undersampling and consequently extreme sample weights in later analyses. Sample weights, what do I mean by that? What are those? So the purpose of sample weights is that in the process, or to ensure that your estimates from your sample reflect the population, your weights actually allow you to adjust for any over or under sampling in your sample, so that your sample estimates reflect what's actually going on in your target population. Next slide, please. So that was a little bit about how we arrived at the sampling strategy for the parent study. What we did for the COVID supplement study, we went through those same steps. I won't go into as much detail as I did for the parent study, but the first thing that we did was arrive at our sample size, and there were some constraints that we had with respect to our supplement. It was smaller in size, so we had a sample size of 200. With a sample size of 200, stratifying by state didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but we still wanted to ensure that we got decent representation across the US. So instead of stratifying by state, we stratified by US Census Division. Again, that means instead of sampling from one hat, we sampled from 9 hats. And those were the houses that we randomly sampled from. How many residences did we sample from each region? So for this, we wanted to do proportionate sampling, but we wanted to make sure that we were sampling proportionate to COVID case rates. We used COVID case rates and sampled proportionally to that. And again, to ensure that our estimates from our COVID supplement sample reflect the population of recovery residences across the country, we'll use weighting to adjust for any over or under sampling in our study. Next slide, please. So sampling and generalizing back to the population based on a sample hinges on knowing something about the population or the frame from which you're sampling. And in simple terms, the sampling frame is just a list of items or people forming the population from which the sample is taken. So in the study that Liz presented on, her frame was residences that were part of the Sober Living Network in LA County. And because she was working with the Sober Living Network, she had a list of residences to choose from or to look at or to have a sense of what was out there. So unfortunately, with the I-STARR project, no such list of recovery residences across the country existed. So we had to create one. And this was quite a chore, and I won't go into much detail here, but pulling from a variety of different sources and implementing a variety of different strategies, we came up with a list of 10,358 unduplicated residences across the country, representing over 3,000 different organizations or providers, which we housed in a relational database. And in that database, we were sure to collect both locating and contact information on each residence in the database. And with the locating information, that's address information, we were able to say something about the availability in the context of recovery housing. And with the contact information, we were able to get in touch with the residences that were randomly sampled. Next slide, please. So before I wrap up, I do want to make sure that I say something about the importance of collaboration with the recovery housing community that you want to be studying. So as Liz discussed, her study hinged on knowledge of the sober living housing landscape in Los Angeles and working in conjunction with the Sober Living Network. For the I-STARR projects, we were working with a wide range of stakeholders, national leaders, state level officials, fellow researchers, and recovery housing providers at every stage of the sampling and recruitment process. For example, collaboration with the recovery housing community was critical when we were developing the sampling frame and when we were getting word out that we may be calling residences about participating in a survey. So this collaboration continues as we're refining our sampling frame to ensure that our sampling weights are accurate. And you may notice that the importance of collaboration is a pretty constant theme in these webinars. It came up last month when we were talking about deciding in a sampling decide, and we'll focus on it more squarely next month when we're talking about principles of community-based participatory research. Next slide, please. So we've tried to cover as much as we could within the context of an hour-long webinar on the topic of sampling methods. But there's so much that can be said on this topic and about the two studies that we highlighted in this webinar. And to make sure that you guys have access to information about this topic, we've pulled together a list of resources where you can learn more. Next slide, please. So this slide contains information on textbooks, journal articles, and other resources that might be helpful to folks in developing your own recovery housing research. In addition to listing these resources on this slide, which is a little bit hard to read, we'll also paste these resources into a link and the links to them in the chat area. If you could do that now, Quinosia, that would be perfect. And it looks like we still have time for some questions. So let's go to the next slide and let me open it up to the group to see if folks have questions for any of the presenters or points of discussion, anything that you're thinking about, struggling with in your own plans for recovery housing research. Feel free to type your questions into the chat. We have folks monitoring that, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can do questions that way as well.
Hi, Amy. I had a quick question. This is Natalie. I was curious earlier when you were y'all were mentioning a convenience sample at the end, that like the pros and cons, and that when collecting data in a new field or like data that's not existing, like the example y'all gave, the presenter said that it might make sense to go with a convenient sample. And so I was just curious, because the I-STARR project is so innovative, right? And it is collecting data that wasn't available, why y'all chose to go with a random sample instead of a convenient sample, if it was just like that was the aim of the study and that's what we got funding to do. And so just like weighing those two when you're doing research with trying to collect data that's not available, just wanting to get more insight into your choice.
Natalie, that is a great question, and I'll lead off, but then I'm going to quickly pass to Mina because that was her slide with the pros and cons. So for the I-STARR project, and I think that probably for all research studies, what I would recommend is that your sampling strategy follows the aims of your project. And indeed, the aims of the I-STARR project was to conduct a national survey of recovery residences, and we wanted our survey to represent the population of all recovery residences in the nation. So that's why we did the sampling strategy, or why we selected the sampling strategy that we did. And of course, there are pros and cons. The con to that is well highlighted in Mina's slide, that it's difficult. So it took a long time for us to create the sampling frame for our study. You know, that was the con to that approach, but we did it because we wanted the benefit of being able to generalize to recovery housing across the country. So Mina, I'm going to let you weigh on this too.
Yeah, I'm not really sure I would add anything else to that. I mean, I think that's exactly it, that the goals of the I-STARR study were to create a sampling frame and then randomly sample within that. So it would not have been possible to meet those aims with a convenient sample. Even though, Natalie, like you're alluding to, it is cutting edge stuff that Amy's working on, and there certainly are questions that we could have answered with a convenient sample. It just would have been a completely different study.
Liz, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, no, thank you. That was good.
Do we have other questions from the chat? Anything that is
Yeah,
pressing?
we just got one from Laura. Is the I-STARR database list of recovery residences around the country available for other researchers to use? Good question.
That is a very good question. So actually, if we can go back to the slides, to the resources. So That's a question about sampling frames and where to find that. So we've dropped in some resources for the National Alliance for Recovery Residences and the Sober Living Network. Those serve as frames. So the I-STARR project created the database, our sampling frame. We're still working on correcting it, or not correcting it, refining it, so that it is reflective, and we're creating our sample weights. And we do hope at the end of the study to make that available via data sharing agreements. But the larger question of having something that's publicly available, that researchers or folks who are wanting to learn about recovery housing and what's going on across the country, that's something that I'm really hoping to advocate for, and hoping that everyone will be advocating for. We have something like that for the treatment system with the SAMHSA treatment locator, but we don't currently have something like that for recovery housing. And something like that for recovery housing would definitely benefit researchers, but I can see it benefiting a wide range of different audiences who want to learn more about recovery housing in their states, in their local communities, and possibly for themselves. Great question. I think that we have time for one more question before we wrap up. I see in here a question about sharing the slides. So that's a great question. That's part of our wrap up. So let's go back to the presentation. This webinar is part of this training series, and we'll have more webinars in the training series next month. We have 2 in September. And they're different tracks. There's one for operators and providers, as well as the researchers for folks who are wanting to conduct research on recovery housing. The recovery housing operator or provider webinar will be on the topic of recovery housing resident policies. And this will be led by Joel Bagley and Beth Fisher-Sanders of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences. Our researcher webinar will be on the topic of principles of community-based participatory research, and will feature Kathy Burlew providing an overview of the topic, and Dr. Lenny Jason discussing this within the context of his research studying Oxford houses. So the I-STARR webinars are always held on Tuesdays from 1 to 2, or excuse me, from 11 to 12 for folks on the West Coast, and from 2 to 3 for folks on the East Coast. So the operator provider webinars, as well as the webinars that are germane to kind of all audiences, are held in the first Tuesday of the month, and the researcher webinars are held on the third Tuesday of the month. And you can learn more about the I-STARR project and our webinars on our website. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. And you, of course, can stay in touch with us with our social media sites as well. We had a question about this webinar and whether it was recorded. It is recorded, and that will be on the website as well. So before folks sign off, I do want to remind folks that this is a series, a part of a 12-part series, and we encourage folks to register for all webinars and to attend all of them. Those who do attend all 12 webinars in this series can receive a certificate of completion, and can also be provided the option of being identified on the I-STARR website as someone who's completed this webinar training series. We can track the attendance for all folks who attend the webinar live, but if you have to miss the live webinar, of course, you can listen to it online. We'll post it, but we're also building a platform, a learning management system, which is more interactive. It will track your attendance. We can also field questions and get feedback about the webinars. And so we encourage folks who registered for the webinar series to actually be participating in the webinars through our learning management system. So I think that's all that I need to impart about the I-STARR project and upcoming I-STARR activities, unless I'm forgetting something. Diane and Dustin, anything else that we should say about the I-STARR series?
No, I dropped in the chat the link to sign up for the newsletter and also to register for upcoming webinars. And yeah, look forward to seeing everybody again. This was really a fantastic talk.
Yep. And before I sign off, I just want to a huge thanks to Meena Subbaraman and Elizabeth Mahoney, who are amazing presenters. So amazing. In fact, you guys will see them in later webinars. So Liz, not next month, but I think the month after, in October, we'll see Liz. And then Meena's coming back to talk about some more nitty-gritty stat stuff later in the series. So thank you guys both for showing up today. And thank you for everyone, to everyone for showing up today. That's
Thank
a
you,
wrap.
Amy.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.